Well, officially, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the American Foreign Service Association. My name is Ian Houston. I am the Executive Director here at AFSA. That's the least important fact of the evening. Welcome, everyone. We appreciate having you here. This is a great use of AFSA space, and thank you for joining us this evening. As a professional association and union, AFSA represents 5 agencies of the Foreign Service and serves some 16,500 members. We take our responsibility to be the voice of the Foreign Service seriously, and we're happy to support other organizations who share our commitment to highlighting the men and women who strive for a better, more peaceful world through diplomacy. In this regard, we are pleased to continue our longtime partnership with the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. For years, the UNA-NCA and AFSA have worked together highlighting the people and stories of diplomacy. And what better way to do that than to invite the men and women who practice it to share their views, stories, etc. with us, with all of you tonight. This is why we are doubly pleased to have with us tonight Ambassador Keith Harper. For nearly a year, Ambassador Harper has been the U.S. representative to the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. He joins us this evening for a discussion on the activities of UNHCR and the U.S. policies that support it. And I'll let our colleagues introduce Ambassador Harper more fully, but we are pleased to have him with us here tonight. Thank you for being here. One note before I turn it over to our colleagues. As I said earlier, this event is being recorded, so we'd like to ask you to please use the roving microphone when we get to that point if you have any questions during the Q&A session. That way we can capture the questions and have them ready for the recording. And you can go back and watch this multiple times if you wish, but we welcome our video audience as well. And now it is my pleasure really to turn the floor over to Ambassador Don Bliss, who I appreciate our friendship and our connection and our association with you. Thank you, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for being here. Ambassador.
Thank you, Ian. UNA-NCA appreciates very much the partnership we have with AFSA. In fact, it's really important to me because my son is a good member of your organization and Foreign Service, and we've enjoyed working together in this wonderful venue for a number of our programs. We have a number of very active committees, but the Human Rights Committee has been especially active in a number of ways, and so it's very fitting that tonight, on this day, the International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia, where if you go on the website, you can see the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon hold up a banner which says, end violence and discrimination against LGBT people. So this is a fitting day for the Human Rights Committee to sponsor an event with the United States representative to the Human Rights Council. I want to say a few thank yous quickly. Paula Boland, our Executive Director, just raise your hand. So if you don't know her, the two co-chairs of our Human Rights Committee, Christine Hansen and Heather Hill. Ed Elmendorf played a key role in this evening, and Ed's been very active in human rights for many, many years, and as well as in this organization as a past president. And of course, our wonderful UNA-NCA staff who put this together, Gina, Toby, and Emily. So thank you very much for all you've done to put this program together tonight. This is a really important year in the UNA-NCA and in the United Nations as well. There will be a new Secretary General. There will be a new President of the United States next year. There'll be a new Congress next year. And so our work will really be cut out for us, however it all turns out, because we'll be resetting a relationship between the U.S. and the United Nations. And so please, if you're members of UNA-NCA, become engaged, help us do our job of increasing public understanding and awareness of the work and values of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and helping to encourage constructive U.S. leadership in the UN, as we will have evidence of in a few minutes here tonight. And finally, help us prepare the next generation of global leaders who will carry on the work that my generation has not done as well as we should in maintaining peace and security, sustainable development, and advocating for human rights around the world. So that's our job. That's the mission of the United Nations. And this is one in a series of many programs we have during the course of the year to try to accomplish that objective. You know, it's my pleasure. You have a bio in your program, so I won't read the whole thing, but Ambassador Keith Harper was nominated by President Obama and confirmed by the Senate on June 4th, 2014. And prior to that, he practiced law with the law firm of Kirkpatrick, Townsend, and Stockton. He serves on the President's Commission on White House Fellowship. And in my early career, I got to know some extraordinary White House fellows, Tim Wirth, who later became president of the UN Foundation, and Henry Cisneros, who was later Secretary of HUD. So it's a wonderful program. He's served as a justice on various tribal courts, and is a member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. He received his BA from the University of California at Berkeley and JD from New York University Law School. And to get things going, you know, I think when the Obama administration decided that the United States should be an active participant and leader in the Human Rights Council, we really started to see things turn around. And I'd like to ask Ambassador Harper, what does he feel as we're coming somewhat close to the end of the Obama administration? What has been the legacy of the Obama administration in the Human Rights Council? How have things changed? And what will we most remember about these years?
Well, thanks, Don, and thanks for the kind introduction. It's very good to be with you this evening. Thanks to UNA and AFSA for having me here, hosting me. The engagement at the Human Rights Council was based on a hypothesis. The hypothesis was that despite the challenges the Council had endured in its first few years, with U.S. engagement, with U.S. leadership, working with our partners, we could make the Council far better in achieving the objectives it's supposed to achieve as an institution, which is to promote and protect human rights around the world. And I think that the legacy will be that we have achieved that objective. It is a council that is far, far more effective in actually having impact on the ground and changing the conversation about human rights in innumerable situations. And that was not something sort of preordained. I mean, that required a decision to spend a considerable amount of resources and time and effort and engagement utilizing all the tools of the State Department to do so. And when the decision was made, it was made cognizant that we would have to utilize those resources, utilize American leadership, and push our partners. Now, I don't think this is something that you can really quarrel about whether or not the Human Rights Council was transformed. As you know, one of the things that the Council has been heavily criticized for, and understandably so, is a hyper-focus on the State of Israel. And there's still a bias on Israel. But the question really is not whether that exists, but whether or not we address it better, and whether or not we can utilize the Council more effectively if we engage. And what we have seen is that that is true. So let me give you just some kind of base statistics on this. Basically, for the first 4 years, the United States wasn't active on the Council, did not seek membership, was not actively engaged. The last 6 years, ending in 2015, we were engaged. In the first 4 years, there were 5 special sessions on the State of Israel. On the last 6 years, while we were fully engaged, there was 1 special session. Now, special sessions are when the situation is so grave and so urgent that the Council cannot wait for another session, ordinary session that happens 3 times a year, March, June, and September, and they have to take action immediately. So these are fairly rare events. And this demonstrates that with our leadership, we can actually focus the Council's attention on actually urgent matters that require immediate action. And what has happened is in situations like Syria or Libya with Gaddafi, in most recently, we called for and led a special session in December on Burundi. All of these things would unlikely have occurred had it not been for this decision to engage. So I think we have an important story to tell on the fact that in many of these instances, we have taken the council and utilized as an effective tool. And so the question is really, so what? What does it actually do? Because our barometer really ought to be in the human rights sphere. Is it affecting changes on the ground, either in the near term or the long term? And the reason we have to put it that way is that sometimes these projects are long term. You look at a state like Burma, where there was a push by the United States for many years. There were sanctions, there were condemnatory resolutions. These things often take far longer than we'd like. But what we know is that with that kind of isolation and pressure, utilizing our relationships around the world, we can make those changes on the ground, even if they take longer than we'd like. And so we have utilized these tools far more effectively. Let me give you two examples. One would be Sri Lanka, and this actually happened quite quickly. The Rajapaksa regime, after the end of the LTTE conflict, also known as the Tamil Tigers in 2010, there was mass atrocities, frankly, in the northern parts of Sri Lanka. Many civilian deaths, IHL violations, significant human rights violations. The Rajapaksa regime would not take any real steps to have any accountability for the end of the LTTE conflict. In addition, they were cracking down on civil society. They were denying freedom of association and assembly, freedom of expression. And the way the council reacted initially when the U.S. wasn't engaged is that they had a special session and congratulated Sri Lanka on committing mass atrocities, in essence. And this was the resolution that was voted at the council. We did not think that was the appropriate role for the council and led a series of three resolutions, ultimately setting up an investigatory mechanism working with countries like the UK to investigate the end of the LTTE conflict. This happened in 2014, in March of 2014. That was a political earthquake in Sri Lanka. And what that led to is a conversation in Sri Lanka about whether or not they could continue to support a regime that had so lost legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. A gentleman named Sirisena ran against Rajapaksa, long story short, as he won the election in January 8th of 2015. And so this action by the council led to a fundamental shift in the policy direction and the politics of Sri Lanka. And now Sirisena announced a completely different way of doing business, opened up space for civil society, let out political prisoners. Look, Sri Lanka has a long way to go to get where they need to get as far as accountability and reconciliation. But they are at least engaged with the international community and moving down the steps of far greater respect for human rights, both presently and in looking back at the end of the LTTE conflict. And this is actually really important for a prosperous and secure Sri Lanka in the future. Because if they fail to have an accountability process that allows and sets the foundation for a proper reconciliation, they will never have the kind of country that they want, because the Tamils will always feel alienated from the majority Sinhalese population. So we can go through other examples like North Korea, where a commission of inquiry was appointed by the council, and it fundamentally changed the conversation in the international sphere regarding the human rights violations of North Korea. It used to be that the United States and our EU partners and Japan and Korea would criticize North Korea for its human rights violations, and the Chinese and others would say, oh, it's really not that bad. These imperialists, they make this kind of stuff up. Now you have a report documented, hundreds of page report documented with great specificity all the human rights violations, crimes against humanity. And it has the imprimatur of the United Nations, and it's far, far more difficult for those same states to make that argument. And so what does China say now? They don't argue whether there's human rights problems. They argue what we should do about them, and we're going about it the wrong way. There's now the human rights situation of North Korea is on the permanent agenda of the Security Council. These may not seem like huge steps, but with respect to North Korea, where we've been able to make very little progress on human rights and even the conversation about how to advance human rights in North Korea, these are critical steps forward. And so I think it's a legacy of saying that we have working very closely with many important partners around the globe, have a council now that doesn't address effectively every human rights situation around the world, but does far better than it did without U.S. engagement. The second point I would say is that the council is and should be perceived, in my judgment, as a battleground of values. That it is a place where we argue about values and whether these values are universal, and whether these values should be there should be exemptions from these universality of these values based on cultural differences. And these are all kinds of questions that are being litigated, if you will, at the council every single session. Without our ongoing engagement, we are going to do far worse on these important questions of values. And the dominant conversation is not going to be one that we either participate in or affect. That is not a good thing, because the international normative system, the one that we've had for 70 years now, is one that where it is adhered to brings greater security, more safety, and greater prosperity. And we see this in country after country. And so this international normative system is one that we should spend a lot of resources guarding. And the council is one of the principal places in which that is discussed. When folks point to the council and they say, well, there's China on the council, there's Venezuela on the council, there is Russia on the council. My response is this, that despite the fact that those states, those human rights abusing states, are on the council, despite that fact, we pass unanimously resolutions on freedom of expression that are based on the United States' views on freedom of expression, or freedom of association and assembly, or freedom of religion and belief. These are core values that are important to the international normative system. And when we litigate them, we prevail far often than we don't. And that is why when we are looking at this system and the import of it, and say it's a cornerstone, human rights is the cornerstone of our foreign policy, one of the places where that is adjudicated, one of the places in which we live up to those values is at the Human Rights Council. Because, look, it is a body of the UN, and that's why it has credibility among some states that it wouldn't have credibility with if it was just a bunch of members from Western Europe and North America. It has credibility with states in other places because it is representative. And that representativeness is sometimes a little uncomfortable because it includes non-democracies and it includes some states that don't share values. But here's the thing. Those states that don't necessarily share our values, they still don't call a vote and vote against the civil society resolution because they don't want the headline to be that they voted against the civil society resolution. There is value to that when we have the next conversation with China or Russia, that they agree to those principles as enunciated in those resolutions.
Well, that's a wonderful description of the Obama legacy at the Human Rights Council. And before we dig deeper into some of these issues, I want to step back for a minute and ask you, what prepared you for this job? I mean, how did you become an ambassador? How was the process of confirmation? And are there any surprises that once you arrived in Geneva and had to deal with an international organization with 47 states represented, what was most surprising about the job as you encountered it?
I'm not going to talk much about the confirmation process because I mean I sort of have forgotten about all that stuff, and thankfully, I'll say a couple things that are surprising to me. Not surprising. Well, yeah, it's surprising. First of all, I don't think we fully appreciate and it's hard to fully appreciate from the outside, the things that you can get done, because oftentimes those things are very quiet things. That you can go to a state and say, hey, we think you should release this political prisoner, or we think that you should do better on this issue. Now, if you publicize that, then in the specific instance, sometimes that makes it so that they can't do those things. And I don't think that from the outside you can see that or fully appreciate what it means to represent the United States. The other surprising, not surprising thing, but thing that I think is noteworthy is I think that despite the complaints, despite the fact that countries around the world oftentimes criticize us for all kinds of things, including our foreign policy, I think that there's a deep reservoir of respect, that we have built institutions in this country. We are a country of rule of law. We're a country that has values that even when it's not in our best interests on a pecuniary level or financial level or other ways, we still live up to those values. Now, I'm not saying that we're perfect. We know we have our challenges, and we're prepared to say we have these challenges and try to address these challenges. But the self-correcting institutions that we have, I think, are ones in which I hear oftentimes people respect. The other thing I think on the negative side sometimes is, I think there is a tendency within multilateral organizations to sometimes have unhelpful conversations that just go on and on and on with no benefit for anybody. You know, there's one conversation regarding this concept called the right to development, and because some states agree that there's a right to development, and we and others don't agree that there's a right to development, then this conversation tends to live out in arguing about whether there is or isn't a right to development, which doesn't really advance either human rights or development, but we still engage in these conversations. And so there is this, I can see why, when people look at the UN and they see some of these examples, they say, why are we doing this kind of thing? So there is that aspect as well, where I think we need to figure out better ways to have some of these conversations.
Now, my understanding is that the U.S. has served 2 terms now in the council, so you've taken a year off.
Yes.
How do you stay engaged and still be a leader in the council
Sure.
when you're not actually have a seat at the council?
No, it's a very good question. I mean, I think what we have seen, what our experience has been, is that membership counts, but much more important than membership is engagement. You look at a country like Sweden, for example, who has not been a member in recent years, but they run the Iran resolution we're in the core group with it, but we run it together with Sweden. They run the groundbreaking resolution on internet freedom, which established the principle, adopted unanimously at the council, that what is allowable offline should be allowable online. Seems pretty reasonable, but there's arguments about this concept on freedom of association and assembly, for example, and whether or not it fully applies on the internet. So these are important concepts and in debates that are at the council. Sweden is quite active. Egypt, not doesn't agree with us on many issues. It agrees with us on some. They're also very active, and they affect the council. So we do the same. I mean, the fact is that we work with our partners, and we can get just about as much done as we did when we were on the council. And I think part of that is the recognition that we will be back on the council next year. We're running on a clean slate. We're going to put all our energy into getting as many votes as we can. The UK and the US are running in the WEOG category to get back on the council next year.
Well, one of the real changes, I think, in the whole UN system has been the activities of civil society and NGOs, and particularly in the human rights area, promoting human rights. And I'm sure they're very strong supporters of what you're trying to accomplish there. But some states are really clamping down on NGOs, making it more difficult for them. How do you find the work of civil society and what you do, and are you concerned about the fact that some of your other states represented on the council are really clamping down on the activities of NGOs?
No, it's quite concerning. I would divide the question into two different aspects. There is civil society participation at the Human Rights Council and through multilateral organizations, and that we, take a very firm stance at regarding. We support resolutions, for example, on reprisals. This is when an individual participates at a UN event and then they are negatively treated back home, or they're filmed while they're there in order to have consequences later. And look, we look at it this way: when there is an attack on an individual or a human rights defender, and that's bad enough in and of itself, but there is a separate crime or separate violation when you do so when they're participating at the UN, because what you're doing is you're undermining the UN as an institution as well. There's an institutional crime, if you will. It's not so different than in judicial systems, where it's a different crime to, say, assault somebody than to assault a witness who's going to testify at a trial. Those are two separate crimes. You may be committing both of them. And here, I think that's true too. And so we take that very seriously. But it is a battlefront, because there are states that don't want that active participation by NGOs. They don't want active participation by dissidents. These are states that are simply not used to being criticized because they don't allow it at home. And so they don't want to allow it in other places. And it's a battlefront, and it's one that we're worth having, because it preserves the institutional legitimacy of the council. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is, I think you're absolutely right. There is this increasing challenge in country after country of the shrinking space of civil society, most concerning in the kind of Russia type. Now China has recently adopted these NGO laws that require registration, that require abiding by all kinds of rules that simply undermine freedom of expression and freedom of association and assembly. One of the things we did in that regard is we thought it would be helpful to explain the difference between, say, our 501c3 laws, our laws on nonprofits, and laws like Russia has or other governments have. Our laws are intended actually to give greater, through tax benefits, are supportive of freedom of expression and freedom of association and assembly. These other laws are seeking to deny freedom of expression and freedom of association and assembly. So yes, they are both NGO laws to a degree, but they have far different impacts on fundamental freedoms.
Well, I think this process of the Universal Periodic Review, where every state has to lay out its human rights record for others to see, and I was looking through the U.S. report, and I was almost shocked at how candid it is in identifying human rights issues in the United States, whether it's our criminal justice system, whether it's incarceration. 25% of the people incarcerated in the world are in the United States, whether it's indigenous populations, whether capital punishment and so forth. Do you get any feedback on that? Do you get any pushback on the fact that we have laid out before the world the fact that we're not perfect on human rights issues? How do you deal with that issue?
No, we do get some political pushback on that. But look, the fact is, when the United States, which as I mentioned earlier, I think, whether it's articulated or not, is widely respected for their institutions that we've built in this country, that institutions of rule of law that exist. When we can say these are our challenges as well, that allows other countries to be it makes it far easier for them to also talk about their challenges. And that's the kind of conversation we want in the Universal Periodic Review. If you actually look at the Universal Periodic Review, which is this opportunity for every state to be reviewed about every 5 years, and its recommendations from other states regarding their human rights, and they can then either accept or not accept, or accept in part the recommendations. If you look at the process for the states that take it seriously, which are the vast majority of states in the world, they have recommendations, they've accepted most of them, and they've implemented many of them. Not all of them, but if you actually look, if our objective at the end of the day is improvement of human rights, to address things like access to capital for women, ensuring that there are processes for prosecuting domestic violence, statelessness issues, on and on and on, the many manifestations of human rights problems around the world, the UPR has actually led to more changes on the ground than virtually any other instrument in the last number of decades. And so it is a very effective institution because most states take it seriously. Now, there's some that don't. North Korea doesn't take it very seriously. Iran doesn't take it very seriously. And for those states, we have other mechanisms to ensure that there is attention brought and that there's focus on these issues. But for many states, it's very effective. You know what the reason the UPR is so beneficial goes, we should compare it to the days of the Commission. During the Commission of Human Rights, no state wanted to be on the agenda of the Commission on Human Rights because it was a scarlet letter. If you were on the agenda, it meant that you had human rights problems, and anybody who wasn't on the agenda didn't have human rights problems, didn't have human rights challenges. The UPR is based on the notion that nobody is perfect. No country is without a challenge. Now, they're going to be different in nature. There are going to be some that are far more substantial than others, but nobody is without a challenge, and nobody and everybody can do better. And because of that, it's not a scarlet letter. And countries are far more willing to have that dialogue in a manner in which it leads actually to improvements on the ground. So look, I'm a big fan of the UPR. I will defend the way we do it because I think the way we do it sets the foundation for allowing other states to do it. And frankly, we should also be candid about the issues that we have. I mean, look, you cannot watch television today. You cannot be in an urban area and think that we don't have a challenge with police use of force in minority communities. I just don't think you can't make that argument with a straight face. Now, it doesn't mean we're not trying to address it. It doesn't, in fact, we are trying to address it. And if you look at what the Department of Justice is doing, we should also talk about that. We should also talk about what the President has said about that. But we shouldn't deny the fact that we have challenges as well.
Well, just to follow up in terms of the way the U.S. is perceived in the rest of the world, a lot of the law of human rights is expressed in treaties. And you've got the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Enforcement of Disappearances, the Mind Ban Treaty, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and none of these have been ratified by the United States. I mean, how can we be a leader in the Human Rights Council if we haven't ratified much of the law, the international law of human rights?
Well, I mean, there are those who make that argument. I mean, our response to it is that these are not binding on us. But if you look, for example, at our domestic laws, they often exceed the requirements under these international instruments. And what we know is that domestic law is oftentimes harder law. It's more enforceable law than international law is. And so, yes, I think that's a position folks can take, but I think that if you drill a little deeper, we're actually largely in compliance and live up to the principles of many of these instruments, even if we haven't ratified them.
Would you like to see them ratified?
It's our position that a number of those should be ratified.
Well, I understand that the High Commissioner on Human Rights has been in town while you've been in town,
Yes.
making the circuit and talking to a lot of different groups and people up on the Hill and so forth. And could you tell us a little bit about how you work with, maybe you could give us a little assessment of how the High Commissioner is doing and how do you work with him, and also the UN itself seems fragmented. There are a lot of different pieces that deal with aspects of human rights. How do you pull that bureaucracy together and have a coherent strategy?
Well, I mean, I will say I'm a big fan of the High Commissioner, Zaid al-Hussein. I think he's done a terrific job. I think because of the part of the world he comes from, he's able to have credibility in a way that's quite helpful. I think he comes from a place where he shares values about the universality of human rights in a manner that we fundamentally agree with. That's not to say we don't have disagreements on a specific issue, and that from time to time he'll criticize the United States, which we're open to that kind of dialogue, even if we don't agree with him on a specific situation. And so we think he is doing a very effective good job. The Council and the United States relies heavily on the Office of the High Commissioner. It has institutional capacity building. It has technical assistance capabilities. It has the ability to report on country situations with or without the Council's urging. And these are all instruments to improve human rights on the ground. And I think, by and large, they do so in a very effective way. They are also the secretariat. They serve as the secretariat of the council. That means the actual operations of the Human Rights Council are done by OHCHR. We work very closely together because I think on many of these situations around the world, say Burundi or South Sudan or DRC, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, these are all situations in which we have the same objectives. We want to see these countries improve their human rights on the ground. We want to see in South Sudan the end of what is incredibly heartbreaking numbers of sexual-based violence. We want to ensure that states that are discriminating against women on citizenship end that practice. So we have the same objectives regarding ensuring that LGBTI persons are not discriminated against, and and that states are addressing violence against LGBTI persons. So on virtually all of these issues, we share values, we share objectives, and they are really our go-to institution to aid us in achieving many of these objectives.
But it must be difficult, though, when you read reports in the newspaper about abuses by United Nations peacekeepers, for example, in the Central African Republic and other places.
Absolutely.
I mean, how do you ensure that the United Nations itself is adhering to the highest standards of human rights? Do you get into those issues?
We do. I mean, those are principally addressed in New York because peacekeeping comes out of New York. But no, we address them to the extent that they are human rights violations and they get raised, and OHCHR has tried to address them as well. And the High Commissioner has spoken eloquently about the need to stamp out this kind of sexual exploitation and abuse. That's an ongoing project. This is a real challenge for the UN system. We are not happy with every aspect of the way that they have responded to the crisis, and it's a crisis of long standing, unfortunately. And there's too many manifestations of it over the years. The High Commissioner, of course, was involved many years ago in trying to address it himself, and wrote a seminal report on steps that should be taken. Some of those have been implemented. Our view is that the UN has to do everything possible it can to ensure the protection of these vulnerable individuals. I mean, the notion that a kid who is, as vulnerable as you can be, a refugee in a camp, is exploited sexually. I mean, that's just so unacceptable and intolerable. Our position has been that they have to take every affirmative step to address it. We think they're doing some of those things, but we're urging them to do more.
Now, there's a lot of talk these days in the Security Council and elsewhere about the terrorism narrative, why young people are drawn to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other forms of terrorism, which are so brutal in their impact. It always seemed to me that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is just a beautiful statement of universal values that we can all adhere to. We don't adhere to them perfectly in this country, but they're wonderful, and it's amazing that that was accomplished so early in the UN's history to come up with these values. And how are you promoting those values positively as an alternative to some of the propaganda you hear and that seems to be successful with a lot of the young people around the world?
No, I think it's an excellent question, and I think that the council is one of the places where we have to talk about how there's not cultural exceptions to them. One specific way we're trying to address it is the United States, along with a core group of 12 countries, it's a fairly large core group, led an initiative on a resolution for preventing and countering violent extremism. And much of the resolution talks about new strategies for doing exactly what you're talking about. We have to expand the conversation. It cannot just be about kinetic ways of stopping terrorism by searching people and surveillance and those kinds of things. We have to win hearts and minds. We have to have folks buy into these values that are more peaceful values, will allow for a more secure world. And one of and one of the things that we have to do is find what are the drivers that are pushing people to violent extremism. And we know some of them. And, you know, I think a lot of folks think of poverty as a driver. The fact is that poverty alone is not a driver, because there's a lot of poor people around the world that are not violent extremists. And so that alone is not a driver. That has to be coupled with something else. And that analysis is something in which every week, every month, we are having more data regarding those things. The fact, though, is that there are other drivers. The denial of political and civil rights are a driver of violent extremism, because people that are disenfranchised, people that feel that have enemy, they feel disconnected from the society because they can't express themselves politically, they will often look for other ways to do so. And so protecting fundamental freedom, and this is the human rights conversation of CVE, and that is protecting fundamental freedoms, ensuring human rights, is one of the key ways in which we are going to reduce the drivers of those who go into violent extremism.
Well, before I open it up for questions from the audience, I have one more question, and I probably shouldn't ask this question, and I'm sure
That's always dangerous.
I'm sure you'll answer it very diplomatically, but I served as the U.S. permanent representative to the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal during an election. And I was truly amazed at people from all over the world, how much they knew about U.S. elections. And they asked me all these questions. I really had to, why is the primary system in Texas this way and that way? I mean, they were really better informed than many Americans. So I have to ask you, what are you feeling? Are you getting a lot of questions about the U.S. election, and how do you handle those questions in Geneva?
I am getting a lot of questions. My stock answer is generally that, I quote the president who says that he has great trust in the American people.
Well, let's open it up to questions from the floor. Yes, right. We'll bring the microphone around. Why don't you introduce yourself, too, before you ask the question?
Sorry, guys. Hi, I'm Alan Saunders. I
Yeah.
do communications, press, and outreach here at the American Foreign Service Association. So if you guys have any questions about what we do, although I'm sure it's a little less interesting than what's going on the stage, but find me afterwards and happy to answer.
And thank you, Alan, for all the work you do to put this together for us. And
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name is Grace Kim. I'm currently at the Korea desk at the State Department. So a lot of scholars have raised that the UNSCR 2270 wasn't effective because the UN stripped away some of our agenda due to human rights concerns. So my question is, how do you compromise our security interest with human rights concerns?
Wow. I will say I don't often run into it as a sort of a challenge to one another. I think that our human rights agenda is one that we pursue, among other reasons, because it aids security. And I'm not going to say that there aren't considerations in an individual case where you have a multifaceted relationship with the country and you have to find ways to address it. And sometimes security enters that equation in the overall consideration of which of the things you do and choose to do, either privately or publicly. But generally speaking, I very much see the way we pursue human rights as a means to better ensure over time greater security, more stability, more peace, and greater development, and more successful development, which ultimately leads to a more prosperous and safer world.
other questions? Steve. Introduce yourself. I could introduce you, but you can introduce yourself.
I'm Steve Mosley. I'm on the board of UNANCA and volunteer for it, and I'm terribly interested in your wonderful talk. Could you take the occasion to say a little bit more about you personally as one of the representatives, extraordinary representative of probably the most disgraceful history and background in the United States in terms of discrimination, and how you are able to discuss that and utilize that conversation in your work today. That's one. And then second, could you, though, just address a couple of the difficult technology issues that cross over security and human rights, drones, surveillance, the requirement that most of us as NGOs trying to get partners in countries who now must have all of their board members, all of their staff vetted through the CIA in order to get clearance to have a collaboration with a local CSO in Kenya or anywhere else. Just talk about those, because they're getting in the way of the good noise we like to make about how the Human Rights Council is making tremendous progress. We're very proud of what you're doing. And at the same time, we're facing how to address those issues on a broad scale, even with our own public, not so much with foreign publics, but as well. Just talk about both those things if you
sure.
would, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Well, on the first point, you know, I think it actually the fact that I'm both a citizen of the United States but also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, I think affords me sometimes an ability to connect with some folks in the developing world in particular who are also tribal people. And we can talk about things that I think resonate among us because we have ceremonies and we have ways of doing things that are very tribal, and we have stories about our ancestors and how those govern our lives and impact us today. It also affords, I think, a sort of opportunity to say, despite the challenges that we've had in our history, and as you say, there have been some real serious problems that I think we all know about. There is a brighter day. I mean, you know, the fact is that if you look at the turn of the century from the 1800s to the 1900s, there were about 250,000 Indians left in the United States. There's now about 3.1 million. We think the number's going to be higher with the census coming up. And if you look at every decade since about 1934, that's when the Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act. That basically changed the worldview of U.S. policy from one of stamping out tribes to promoting tribes as governing bodies and having some internal autonomy and sovereignty. And that has just increased over the years. Every decade since then, tribes and tribal people have done better and have been more prosperous. And still there are challenges in some places, some serious challenges, some health issues, certainly suicide rates that are higher. In some places, violence against Native women that are pretty clearly unacceptably high. But that it's a road, that the trajectory is a very good one. And I think it is a telling story about how, with a change in perspective and the recognition of a people as self-governing and being able to grow self-reliant institutions, you can actually move away from a very dark history to a much better future. And I think that kind of messaging resonates in a lot of places as one of hope, of one of a possibility for a better tomorrow. And certainly, you know, I'm a big fan of this administration's Native policy. I think the president has been by far the most forward-leaning, pro-tribal president in the history of the United States. I think on key objective after key objective of tribal communities, he has lived up to them well beyond expectations. On your other question, those are some of the most challenging things that we deal with. Look, I don't think anybody believes there is a perfect answer, because part of this is that the technology is advancing so quickly that it's hard to create rules that might be superseded in the very near future. So you talk about things like surveillance, and you know, we're dealing, right, I'm thinking about this right now because we're dealing with this dialogue on encryption, and I mean, I'm a Luddite by nature, so these things are so beyond my scope of understanding. But from what I understand from the experts, you know, the technology is advancing so quickly that we're trying to create rules based on foreseeable future that we cannot foresee. So these are real challenges, and I don't think anybody believes that with certainty we have the perfect balance right now. I do think that this is a place where we have to have ongoing conversations about what is the most effective use of surveillance and how do we balance that with privacy interests. And we don't want to get that wrong, but we also don't want to say it's all one or the other, like privacy trumps surveillance or surveillance trumps privacy, because I do think that those things have to be balanced. And your other aspect of your question, I mean, I'm interested in hearing more specifics about how this is affecting things. We're constantly trying to reassess whether or not these rules regarding actors from other countries are fair, and whether or not they're inhibiting things that we care about. And if there's more examples of that, maybe we can talk afterwards and I can get some more information on that, because I don't think we're in a place where we're saying we have the perfect answer on these things, but we do have the policies that are in place.
Thank you. My questions were softballs compared to these
I
questions.
know.
Ed.
And thanks. I'm Ed Elmendorf. Like Steve, a board member and longtime UNA volunteer, and I'll follow Steve's model with a double-barreled question. The first is, could you address the impact of the UPR and the other UN human rights mechanisms within the United States? I know your obligation is more external, but you did refer to DOJ and DHS, and I know that there was a big involvement by the administration from other agencies in the UPR, so I'd appreciate your addressing impact within the U.S. The other question concerns the new global goals for sustainable development adopted by the UN last year, and particularly Goal 16 and the rule of law. How do you see the interaction between the set of global goals and the work of the UN on human rights? Thanks.
Both excellent questions. On the first, I can tell you that there is due consideration given to the recommendations, the ones that we've accepted, and various entities within the federal government are trying to see how we address those. Some of it is a little complicated to discuss because there's deliberative process privileges and other things. Let me give you one specific example about how effective these things can be. We had our review of the Committee Against Torture. The CAT sets up the Committee Against Torture. It reviewed us last November. November 2014. And of course, there were interpretations of the CAT, legal interpretations of the Bush administration regarding the extent to which the CAT applies and in what circumstances and where it applies jurisdictionally. And so it's no surprise that President Obama has a very different view of torture generally and some of the legal underpinnings that are different from what the prior administration's views were. But with the review, that prompted a very specific question. Do we believe that the prior administration's interpretations of the CAT were right or they weren't right? Did we agree with them or did we disagree with them? Now, these are questions you don't normally have to answer unless you're under review. But now you have to answer it because you're going to get that question in the committee. So we had an extensive process by which there were many, many voices from many parts of the federal government, and they litigated heavily this question as to what our legal interpretations of the CAT were. And ultimately, we came out and were able to announce November of 2014 that torture is illegal at all times in all places without exception. Now, that's important because when the United States can make that kind of statement, then that resonates with the entire international community, particularly since our experience of the last decade and a half. So that's an example in where in that case it was a treaty body, not the UPR, but where these mechanisms force countries to have conversations that they might not otherwise have. On the question regarding the SDGs, I do think it is important now to have what you could call the conversation between the interrelationship between human rights and development. And I think that there's a couple of foundational principles that we can and should adhere to. The first one is this, that development is not a precondition to improving human rights. We can't agree to the contrary, that it has to happen first before you can improve human rights, because human rights are universals. And the simple example is you don't need more resources to stop torturing people. You just have to stop torturing people. So it can't be seen as a precondition. The second principle I think that we can agree to is that human rights, particularly certain ones, are critical for effective development. The empirical data could not be more clear on this point. If you are a developing country, if you want to have successful development, you have to empower your women. You have to have gender equity in the workplace. You have to have access to capital for women. You have to have better education for schoolgirls. You have to address violence against women. You have to have sexual and reproductive freedoms. These things are critical to your success economically. Failure to do those things, the converse is true, failure to do those things completely undermines your ability to effectively develop. So that's an example, and there are others, rule of law areas, as Goal 16 emphasizes, where improvement of human rights is going to significantly aid your success economically. And that's another principle which I think we should feel comfortable articulating. We have articulated. There's another aspect to this, and that is that effective development can provide resources. It's not a necessary precondition, but it can provide resources for you to build institutions that allow you to do better on human rights. I mean, think about judicial systems where you have the ability to train judges and train police forces and have lawyers provided to criminal defendants. These are all areas in which you are going to have better due process of law. Those are human rights issues. And so a kind of an easy way of saying this is that these two things are mutually reinforcing, development and human rights and development. They mutually reinforce one another. That is not a conversation that we have had in an effective way within multilateral fora. And the reason we haven't had that is because of this distraction, in my view, of the right to development. Now that the SDGs are in place with such a clear enunciation on Goal 16 of this idea of the importance of human rights as a necessary, importance of human rights to set the conditions for effective development, I think we're at a place where we may be better able to have that conversation.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, way back here.
Just
yes.
one note before we go on. We'll try to get to everybody's questions tonight, but if we don't, or if you guys think of anything afterwards, do remember there's the hashtag #AskAmHarper in the back of your brochure here. So if you have any other questions,
I didn't know about that hashtag.
ask away. Questions?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for coming and speaking with us and elucidating some of the work that you've done in your background. I'm Leonard Horn. I volunteer with UNA-NCA. I had a question about the co-opting and the debasement of the human rights discourse in the language used by countries that are more egregious offenders of human rights, say China. Tajikistan is an example. how do preeminent individuals such as yourself in the human rights arena address the debasement of human rights terminology? Because what happens when those countries use those terms is they sort of delegitimize the language, and it becomes meaningless. When we say, oh, and human rights are important, well, it becomes a relative term with different countries with different records using the same terms. So how do you address the language issue, the semantic issue there?
No, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, I think that there is we've got to first say why are they doing this? The reason countries try to do these things of utilizing language in different definitions is because they're trying to excuse their human rights violations. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what they're doing. They're trying to say these aren't human rights violations because we interpret it this way. And and I think we have to always go back to the fact that these are norms, and that means there is a particular standard. There's a particular thing that's the acceptable conduct and what's not acceptable. And is there room for different ways of achieving the standard? Yes, there is. But you have to achieve the standard. And so we address that, I think, effectively by the facts and the truth. I'm a litigator by trade, so, and I guess a recovering litigator at this point, but and so I'm very pragmatic by nature because when you're representing clients, you're pragmatic. You want to get the goals achieved of your clients. But in one aspect, I don't mean to get esoteric, but I think there is one thing that is less sort of pragmatic in the near term that we have to that your question is getting to, and that is that truth matters. That the reason why I think when China criticizes us and says and it doesn't resonate, but when we criticize China, they go crazy, is because truth matters. Because when we say it, it is the truth. They are arresting people and throwing them in jail for freedom of expression. They are arresting their lawyers because they're representing people trying to exercise fundamental freedoms. They are kidnapping people from Hong Kong and Thailand in order to undermine their human rights and to deny them the ability to freely express themselves. And so truth matters. The fact is that the record indicates that they're doing that conduct, and those are violations of human rights. Whereas when they say when they use the rhetoric, it falls flat because, first of all, we have a robust political conversation in these countries that constantly churns, and so we're more immune to their criticisms, but oftentimes they do so in a way that is without tethering it to the factual record. And so I think it's very important in these circumstances to guard one's credibility and try to base everything that you do on the truth and the record. And that's what we try to do at our work.
Other questions? Yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So my name is Erica Rogers. I'm a local member of the UNA here, and I work with an organization called Youth for Human Rights. So earlier you were mentioning how in recent years, a lot more youth have become involved with extremist groups such as ISIS. And you kind of related this to them not being able to feel they were able to participate within their government. They weren't able to have a voice in some way or another and really exercise their rights as citizens. So what I'm curious to know is, do you feel that if that's the case, if a more broad education of basic fundamental human rights in schools, as listed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, would be helpful to youth of this generation in improving that?
I do think it would be helpful. I do think, inculcating our children with these values that of tolerance, of freedoms is important. And I want to be clear on this point. That I was trying to use those as an example of drivers. I think that there are many drivers, and part of the analytical framework that the Secretary General is trying to create, is to have a conversation about what are the drivers and how do we get empirical data to understand better how these drivers work together in creating, future generations of violent extremism, or avoiding having youth become violent extremists. That's the analysis that we're trying to create. One of the drivers we know is the denial of political and civil freedoms. Do I think that we should that societies should educate to a greater degree on the importance of these values? Absolutely. I don't think we talk about them enough. I don't know how many people know how instrumental the international rule-based order has been in achieving peace and prosperity in large swaths of the world. I mean, the fact is that, look at Europe. Europe was in war basically constantly for centuries. And it's not now. Why? Because there's been a general acceptance, not that there is not breaches, not that there is not departures, but a general acceptance that this international rule-based order should be followed. And I think, if you look at how Latin America has transformed in the last 30 years, why? Because they have adopted, in essence, the same paradigm of this international rule-based order, because that rule-based order, we know, creates greater security and greater prosperity. And so, yes, I do think that it would be helpful to inculcate the understanding that this is so critical to ultimately peace and prosperity.
Another question? Final question? Yes. Yeah. Why don't we have two questions here, and then we'll wrap up and give a break to our ambassador, who coming back to the United States is not coming back for R&R.
Hi, my name is Christina Hansen. I'm co-chair of the Human Rights Committee and on the board as well. My question is, well, I want to avoid having two questions since I know we're wrapping up, but
that's all right.
It might happen. My first question is, you spoke about how the international community views the HRC and criticizes it because we have severe human rights abusers on the council. But my question is, what challenges and what opportunities do you see when you are sitting across the table from them, and how do you engage with them? And my second question, because I am going to go ahead and ask
how do I engage with states that are
China, Venezuela,
yeah,
Russia,
exactly.
Saudi Arabia?
Exactly.
No, fair point. Good question.
Specifically, what challenges and opportunities, especially this is an election year, and there's a chance that we might get, an ambassador to the UN who has more of a John Bolton perspective versus Samantha Powers. So keeping that in mind, how would you frame what opportunities are?
Why don't we get the other question? And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
yeah.
Oh, well, I was just going to ask, my name is Scott Bell. I work for a financial regulator, actually, but have some human rights experience, including in Geneva. And I was just going to ask if there was any kind of human rights issue that concerns you that's kind of under the radar that, the average, even well-informed person might not be familiar with, whether it's an issue or a region or a country or anything like that.
I'll give you a region or country and an issue. On the country, I'm concerned very much so with the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I think the likelihood that Kabila will run for a third term is troubling and may lead to some serious instability. And we know, particularly in that area of Africa, that kind of instability often quickly turns into instability that takes on ethnic tones and can be very challenging. And so we're certainly paying a lot of attention to that, and I think other countries are as well. And we hope that it doesn't move in that direction, but we will be consistently kind of looking at that. And on an issue side, there's many issues, I think, but I think I am particularly concerned. I mentioned it earlier, or I hinted at it earlier, I'm particularly concerned at the closing space of civil society. I mean, to me, robust civil society is essential for good governance. You cannot have good governance without the ability for people to come together and address issues of concern, particularly those vis-a-vis their governments. And in too many places, we are having NGO laws, or we're having other manifestations of these closing spaces for civil society. And it's oftentimes in the guise of national security or anti-terrorism, but they're really to sort of try to preserve the governmental status quo. I think post-Cold War, this is the most significant challenge, or potentially one of the most significant challenges to the international rule-based system. So I think we have to pay a lot of attention to the closing space of civil society. You know, I think with respect to the question regarding the states without human rights, good human rights records, I would actually put these states in a couple of different categories. One, I think you have states that have really challenging human rights situations where they have political will, or some political will, or discernible political will to do better, but they simply don't have the institutional capacity, they don't have the wherewithal, they don't have basic institutions. And I put those in a very different category than, I say, a South Sudan or a North Korea, because those places, you don't have any political will. So you can't engage with those states to improve by providing them technical assistance or encouragement or wherewithal. And what I find is that many of those states who are in that category, if we can sort of, they want to do better, and they're trying to get there, and they're actually voting and participating in things like the Human Rights Council, not based on their present reality, but where they want to be. And they're oftentimes ones that will join us because they're voting where they're voting their aspirations. There are those states that are just, you know, they're not there, and we just have to manage it. And oftentimes, though, the way to do that is to have initiatives where it's very challenging for a state like that, who doesn't necessarily agree with us, but they don't want to be seen as the one who votes against or calls for a vote to vote against internet freedom. Because who wants the headlines in the New York Times to be X country voted against internet freedoms? And so there's some of that we try to navigate, if you will, the council's agenda to ensure that we are still able to achieve successes despite the presence of countries of that nature.
Well, thank you. You know, one of the underlying assumptions of what we do with the United Nations Association with the National Capital Area is that constructive U.S. leadership at the UN can make a huge difference. And I think that assumption has been fully validated this evening. Thank you so much, Ambassador Harper.